Welcome to our exploration of Paul's commands in 1 Corinthians 7. Today we'll uncover the deep roots of Paul's teachings in the Torah and the prophets, demonstrating how his instructions to the early church were grounded in the timeless wisdom of Scripture. 1. Marital duties and sexual relations. Paul begins by addressing marital duties and sexual relations in verses 3 to 6. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time. These instructions echo the Torah's view of marriage as established in Genesis 24. Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother, and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. This verse establishes the foundational principle of marriage as a unified relationship, which Paul builds upon in his teaching about mutual marital duties. The concept of unity and mutual belonging is further reinforced in the Song of Solomon 2:16. My beloved is mine, and I am his. This poetic expression of marital devotion aligns with Paul's emphasis on the reciprocal nature of the marriage relationship. The idea of not depriving one's spouse finds its roots in Exodus 21:10, which states, If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital rights. Although this verse addresses a polygamous situation, Paul applies this principle of maintaining marital rights to monogamous marriages, emphasizing the importance of mutual care and consideration. 2. Marriage and singleness. In verses 8 to 9 and 26-27, Paul discusses the merits of both marriage and singleness. He advises, Now to the unmarried and the widows I say, it is good for them to stay unmarried, as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry. This balanced view reflects the diversity of callings we see in the Tanakh. We have examples of revered married couples like Abraham and Sarah, as well as dedicated single servants of Elohim like the prophet Jeremiah, whom Yahuwah instructed in Jeremiah 16:2, You shall not take a wife, nor shall you have sons or daughters in this place. Here, we see Elohim explicitly calling Jeremiah to singleness for the sake of his prophetic ministry. This demonstrates that singleness can be a divine calling, just as Paul suggests in his letter to the Corinthians. In the New Testament, Yeshua affirms both marriage and singleness in Matthew 19 verse 11 to 12, saying, Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For there are eunuchs who were born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. This teaching from Yeshua is remarkably similar to Paul's advice in 1 Corinthians 7. The Messiah acknowledges that some are called to celibacy, eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, while others are not. His statement that not everyone can accept this word aligns perfectly with Paul's recognition that singleness is good, but not everyone has the self-control for it. By giving this teaching, Yeshua establishes the very doctrine that Paul later expounds upon in his letter, showing a clear continuity between the Messiah's teachings and Paul's instructions to the early church. 3. Divorce and separation. Paul's teachings on divorce and separation in 1 Corinthians 7:10 to 13 and 15 state, To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or the sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. These instructions are rooted in the Torah's high view of marriage. Malachi 2:16 declares, The man who hates and divorces his wife, says Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel, does violence to the one he should protect, says Yahuwah Almighty. So be on your guard, and do not be unfaithful. This strong statement against divorce forms the foundation for Paul's instruction to avoid divorce if possible. Paul's teachings on marriage and divorce are firmly rooted in Scripture, yet he also demonstrates a nuanced understanding of the unique challenges faced by the Corinthian believers. In addressing the issue of unbelieving spouses, Paul acknowledges the broader cultural differences and seeks to help his followers navigate their faith within their specific social context. Corinth was a city known for its diverse religious practices and widespread idol worship. In this environment, a believer married to an unbeliever might face significant challenges in maintaining their faith. Paul's guidance reflects a balance between upholding the sanctity of marriage as established in Torah and recognizing the complex realities of life in a predominantly pagan society. By allowing for the possibility of separation if an unbelieving spouse chooses to leave, Paul isn't contradicting earlier scripture, but rather applying timeless principles to a new situation. He's providing pastoral guidance that aims to preserve both the integrity of the believer's faith and the peace of their household. This approach demonstrates Paul's wisdom in applying Torah principles flexibly to new cultural contexts, always with the goal of helping believers live out their faith authentically in challenging circumstances. 4. Remaining in one's situation. In verses 17 to 24, Paul advises believers to remain in their current life situations, whether circumcised or uncircumcised, slave or free. This teaching reflects the Torah's emphasis on contentment and faithfulness in one's calling. We see this principle in action with Joseph, who remained faithful to Elohim, whether as a slave in Potiphar's house or as a prisoner. His story, spanning Genesis 37 to 50, exemplifies the idea of serving Elohim faithfully, regardless of one's circumstances. Ecclesiastes 3:1 reminds us, there is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens. This verse encapsulates the wisdom that our current situation, whatever it may be, has a purpose in Elohim's plan. Paul applies this principle to the varied life circumstances of the Corinthian believers. In the New Testament, we find a similar sentiment in Philippians 4:11, where Paul writes, "I am not saying this because I am in need, for I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances." Here, Paul himself models the contentment he encourages in others, showing how this principle applies in the context of faith in Yeshua. 5. Attitude towards worldly concerns. Paul's instructions in verses 29 to 31 to live as if not engrossed in worldly affairs echo the wisdom literature of the Tanakh. Ecclesiastes 1:2 declares, "Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless," reminding us of the transient nature of worldly things. This perspective aligns with Paul's call to hold loosely to worldly matters. Psalm 39:4-5 similarly puts our earthly existence in perspective. "Show me, Yahuwah, my life's end and the number of my days. Let me know how fleeting my life is. You have made my days a mere handbreadth. The span of my years is as nothing before you. Everyone is but a breath, even those who seem secure." This psalm's meditation on the brevity of life provides a foundation for Paul's teaching about prioritizing eternal matters over temporal ones. Yeshua reinforces this idea in Matthew 6:19-20. "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal." Yeshua's words here directly parallel Paul's instruction to live with an eternal perspective, showing how Paul's teaching aligns with the Messiah's emphasis on heavenly priorities. 6. Focus for married versus unmarried. Paul's distinction between the focus of married and unmarried believers in verses 32-34 reflects the different responsibilities and callings we see throughout Scripture. In the Torah, we see how the priests were given special instructions due to their dedicated service to Yahuwah. Leviticus 21:7 states, "They must not marry women defiled by prostitution or divorced from their husbands, because priests are holy to their Elohim." This verse shows how marital status was considered relevant to one's spiritual service, a principle Paul applies more broadly to all believers. The prophet Samuel, dedicated to Yahuwah's service from childhood, exemplifies the focused devotion Paul describes for the unmarried. 1 Samuel 3:1 tells us, "The boy Samuel ministered before Yahuwah under Eli. In those days the word of Yahuwah was rare. There were not many visions." Samuel's singular focus on serving Yahuwah from a young age illustrates the kind of undivided attention Paul speaks of regarding unmarried believers. 7. Decisions about marriage. Paul's advice about marriage decisions in verses 37 to 38 reflects the Torah's respect for individual choice in marriage. In Numbers 36:6 we read, "This is what Yahuwah commands for Zelophehad's daughters. They may marry anyone they please, as long as they marry within their father's tribal clan." This verse demonstrates that even within the constraints of tribal affiliation, there was room for personal choice in marriage partners, a principle Paul applies to the decision to marry or remain single. The story of Rebekah in Genesis 24:57-58 also illustrates this principle of choice. Then they said, "Let's call the young woman and ask her about it." So they called Rebekah and asked her, "Will you go with this man?" "I will go," she said. Rebekah's agency in choosing to marry Isaac serves as a precedent for the personal decision-making Paul encourages regarding marriage. 8. Remarriage for widows. Finally, Paul's instructions about remarriage for widows in verse 39 are grounded in Torah principles. Deuteronomy 25:5 provides for the care of widows through levirate marriage. If brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. While this law was specific to preserving family lineage, it shows the Torah's concern for widows' welfare and remarriage, which Paul adapts to the new context of the early church. Paul takes this principle of caring for widows and applies it to the broader Christian community, allowing remarriage, but emphasizing the importance of marrying within the faith community. This adaptation shows how Paul thoughtfully applies Torah principles to new situations in the diverse early church. In conclusion, Paul's teachings in 1 Corinthians 7, while addressing the specific context of the early church, are deeply rooted in the eternal principles found in the Torah and the prophets. By understanding these connections, we gain a richer appreciation of the continuity between the Tanakh and the New Testament, seeing how Elohim's wisdom guides his people through changing times and circumstances. As we reflect on these teachings, may we be inspired to dive deeper into Scripture, always seeking to understand and apply Elohim's timeless truths to our lives and communities. Until next time, Shalom.